Welcome back to the channel, everyone. Now today we're going to be tackling a pretty common Miata problem, which is a clutch slave cylinder failure, which will prevent you from being able to shift into various gears easily. It may lock you out completely. I had a very hard time getting into reverse a few times, which is what led me to find that this was my issue. Now, since I was replacing the slave cylinder, I figured I'd do a few more things while I'm in there. So I did the master cylinder, I did the slave cylinder, and I also decided to upgrade my clutch fluid line to this stainless steel one from Flying Miata. In addition to your replacement parts, you'll also need a can or two of brake and clutch fluid. Now we're going to start off by opening the hood and removing the master cylinder first. The master cylinder is held on by two 12mm bolts, as well as it is connected with a 10mm bolt to the clutch line. So you're going to want to put a rag under here because clutch fluid is rather caustic and can burn away your paint. And then using a 10mm flare nut wrench, you can loosen up this line and remove it. The two 12mm bolts holding the master cylinder onto the car can then be removed with a combination of ratchets and wrenches. There's a little bit of a tight fit here, so you may have to use a wrench or a smaller ratchet to get in there. We can then go ahead and remove our master cylinder from the car, being careful not to spill any fluid anywhere. And with the master cylinder removed, you can see how the system works. When you push on the clutch, it'll press this rod into the master cylinder, which then pushes hydraulic fluid to the slave cylinder, which then actuates the clutch. Now, on the other side of the car here, we can go ahead and start removing the pigtail over here, which is what is going to be removed by replacing it with the stainless steel braided line. A lot of people argue that this gives you a better clutch feel, and so I figured I would go ahead and do this upgrade as well. First thing you're going to want to do is unhook the slave cylinder with these two 12mm bolts, as well as the line with a single 10mm at the top here. You can go ahead and use a flare nut wrench again here, which should loosen up the line, and then you can go ahead and disconnect it. Now we can go ahead and remove the stock clutch line. There are a couple C-clips that you'll need to remove using two screwdrivers. As you can see here how it works, you put one screwdriver in this tab here, and then the other behind it in the opening. That should allow you to pry it off. There's one here connected to the clutch line, and then one a little bit lower, which I'll show you in a moment. Once we have that off, we can continue with our process of removing the old clutch line. There's this sort of rubber hose up here, and then the pigtail, as it's called, down below. Now, to remove the pigtail, as well as to get to the slave cylinder, you will need to remove your front wheel. The pigtail is held on to the engine with a single 10mm bolt. So go ahead and remove that, and then you should be able to get everything loose. Now, I did have to disconnect this hose from the pigtail to make it a little bit easier to pull it out. You just use two wrenches. I believe I use a 10 and a 17 here to hold the two ends of the hose. You pull them against each other, and that should remove it. And once you get it off, it'll look something like this. You have the old hose and the pigtail, which will all be replaced by this single stainless steel braided line. Now, I somehow lost my footage of removing the slave cylinder, but you just take out those two 12mm bolts, and then you can go ahead and put in the new one. Make sure you attach it to the transmission before threading in the two bolts. Once you have them finger tight, you can then go ahead and get a torque wrench on there, and the correct spec is 12 to 16 foot-pounds. Now we can go ahead and start attaching our stainless steel clutch line. There's no exact perfect way to do this. Some people like to attach the C-clip first. Some people like to leave it till later. I tried putting it on first. I found out it's actually easier to leave it off to give you a little more wiggle room, and then you can go ahead and attach it at the end. But anyways, you're going to first attach the clutch line here that goes to the master cylinder. So go ahead and thread that on just loosely, and then tighten it down with your flare nut wrench. Once you have that nice and tight, it'll hold the stainless steel line up against the bracket, and then you can attach your C-clip. Once that is done, you can then route the rest of your line down to the slave cylinder through the engine bay, and then you can go ahead and sort of tighten it down into the slave cylinder. I found it easier to actually do it in two pieces, so remove the first sort of coupler and then attach the clutch line to that coupler while it's on the Once you have it finger tight, you can then go ahead and snug it down all the way with a flare nut wrench. Now that we have the slave cylinder and new clutch line installed, we can go ahead and replace the master cylinder. Now, before you install the master cylinder, it's important that you sort of burp or prime it just to make sure that there's the least amount of possibility for any air bubbles in the system. So what I like to do is remove it from the packaging, open up the cap here, and then what you're going to want to do is fill it up with some DOT4 or DOT3 brake fluid, clutch fluid, and then you're going to push on this rear part here where the cylinder would get pushed against using a screwdriver or something like that. This will essentially force the fluid through the system, thus priming it and getting it ready to attach to the car and minimizing the chance you have of getting air in the system. So go ahead and push here with a screwdriver a few times. You'll hear some fluid start to kind of burp through. A little bit might squeeze out, so have a rag ready. And then once you have it primed, you're ready to attach it onto the car. Again, the master cylinder is held on by this hose, which is a 10mm nut here, which you can use a flare nut wrench to tighten back on. And then it's also held on by those two 12mm bolts. Now, I did not find any torque specs for this, but I just got it sort of good and tight, and that was good enough for me. Once you have your master cylinder back in the car, go ahead and fill it up with some clutch fluid, and then you're going to go down to the slave cylinder and open up the little cap here on the right and attach a brake bleeder bottle. This will then allow you to bleed the system. So what you're going to do is attach this bottle, then go inside the car and press the clutch a few times. This will actuate the hydraulic system. It'll push any air bubbles out of the system. You will see the level go down in the reservoir. If it goes too low, you'll have to redo this whole system. So make sure that if it gets low, you fill it back up with a little bit more fluid, and then keep repeating until you see no more air bubbles coming out of the bleed bottle. This is much easier with two people, but you can do it by yourself if you need to. Once you see no more air coming out, go ahead and remove the bleeder bottle hose, tighten down the nipple, and then you can reattach your front wheel, lower the car, and you are all done. I hope this video was of help to you. This did solve my hard shifting issues on the Miata. It is a pretty common issue on both NA and NB Miatas, and so hopefully this is something that will help you out. If you haven't done so, please consider subscribing. I'd really appreciate it. And as always, I'll catch you next time.